2, and we got to the second half of the chapter last week, which specifically turns its attention to, in the public worship context, from prayer to gender roles. Paul said in verse 8, I desire. That's an apostolic desire, as we mentioned, is not just a wish or a whim, but is authoritative. And he says that men pray everywhere. That is, men are to take the lead in the public worship. Lifting up holy hands, we mentioned that this word for, first of all, for men is the Greek word for the male gender. This is not a generic Greek term for mankind, anything of that nature. But we're talking about the male gender. And of course, females did pray. There's no question about that. And in fact, this morning in our worship assembly, when prayer is led, I would hope that each one of us is praying. But we're talking about a question of leadership here. And then we mentioned the lifting up holy hands. That's a figure of speech. Synecdoche, part put for the whole. That is, there's no such thing as literal holy hands, just like there's no such thing as literal holy water that kills vampires. But what it means is we're talking about men of holy disposition. The type of men who would lead us in public worship need to be of a certain character. And he says, without wrath and doubting. The New King James and the King James say that's not a great translation. The American Standard, ESV says quarreling. The NASB says dissension. The American Standard says disputing. And those are probably all better words. But we're talking about, these are not men that are contentious in nature, is the word there in the Greek. Yeah. Do what? Which scripture are you talking about? Oh, I'm sorry. We're 1 Timothy 2. That was like 5 minutes ago. You know, yell at me or something. All right. We mentioned all of this past week. And it's evident, perhaps, that based on this context, now remember, Paul is he's writing to Timothy, encouraging him, because he's going to be dealing with some false teachers there in Ephesus. Perhaps Judaizing teachers, perhaps those of the proto-Gnostic type. And so it would be easy on the part of commentators to speculate that if Paul is having to address this issue of gender roles, it may be that that's an indication that these false teachers had found a fruitful hearing among the women. Sometimes false teachers get a hold of a certain segment in a congregation. They may find some fruitful ground among a certain gender. They may find some fruitful ground among a certain age. I heard a church one time in Alabama that all the young adults came to the elders and wanted them to pay for the softball team. Well, the elders wouldn't pay for the softball team, so they all left and split and started another church. Well, yeah.
I can't always say the word, but cultural issues are difficult to eradicate also. We bring to any experience what our experience is.
Absolutely.
Those things have a profound effect.
Sure.
So the cultural thing has a lot to do with that too.
And so that's why when we study God's Word, it's obviously, as we discussed in our study of ascertaining Bible authority, we have to call out, or we have to differentiate between those things that are cultural in nature and those things that are abiding truth. And that's what we're talking about here. And we'll get to that, of course, as we get to the end of this chapter, as Paul gives his foundation for these particular exhortations. So, I think we got to this area where it talks about women adorning themselves in modest apparel. The word for apparel is K-A-T-A-S-T-O-L-E. And it probably, according to, and I'm looking at Earl's word studies of Greek words. And the good thing about his book is he quotes from a lot of different Greek scholars. So you get kind of a smattering of how people, the experts, understand this word. I mean, you understand that the Greek that the New Testament is written in is not being used anymore. As a Latin teacher at Briarcrest told my daughter, Latin is not a dead language, it's an immortal language. That's the same with Koine Greek. But as we study this word, it signifies more than just the dress. Okay, it involves not only the dress, but the entire demeanor. I like what one commentator said, the entire phrase bespeaks of a well-ordered carriage. Okay, how does a woman carry herself? And so it is true that it does speak of outward attire, but it goes beyond that. It reflects a certain attitude. And then this word for modest, cosmios, I guess is how it's said, C-O-S-M-I-O-S, signifies well-arranged, orderly, has to do with neatness. Okay, so again, we're talking about things that are appropriate, and that is, bottom line, what you could say is the woman's outward appearance should be a reflection of her spiritual character and demeanor. And so when we talk about modest apparel, and we're certainly, well, let's keep going and we'll make some more comments on that. He says with, the New King James says with propriety and moderation. I think the King James uses the word shamefacedness, which is not a word. This is a total mistranslation by the King James translators. It's what's known as a textual corruption. The American Standard Version uses a more correct term, shamefastness and sobriety. The problem is nobody knows what shamefastness means either. So, you know, when we start talking about these words, the Greek term is eidos, A-I-D-O-S, and it is found only here in the New Testament. One commentator says it implies a moral repugnance to what is base and unseemly, self-respect, as well as restraint imposed on oneself from a sense of what is due others. It signifies the modesty which shrinks from overstepping the limits of womanly reserve. In other words, these are women that know what it means to be ashamed. You remember in the Old Testament, the prophet one time said, God through the prophet said, my people, they don't know how to be ashamed anymore. They can't even blush. Well, that's not a Christian woman. Okay. She knows what is proper and appropriate. And so again, the outward attire expressing her true character. Sobriety, the Greek word is S-O-P-H-R-O-S-U-N-E, has to do with the habitual inner self-government, a good judgment on the part of the woman of what she wears. And then it says not with braided hair. I think the King James says voided, but it should be braided hair, or gold, or pearls, or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. So somebody says, well, I can't dress up then. Well, let's think about it for a moment. The Bible never condemns women taking some reasonable amount of pride in their appearance and trying to look attractive. In fact, I would hope you would want to do that. The Bible does not teach that beauty is evil and sloppiness a virtue. And the fact of the matter is that during that day and age, braided hair was a common style, and alone, according to Mounts, would not raise the issue of impropriety. In fact, I mean, and you think about culture that was mentioned earlier. Societies go through times when, long hair is, that's what women are supposed to have, and then it shifts back and forth. And so there is some culture involved in that. But how do I know that this is not an outright censure on any of these kinds of things? Well, turn over to Ezekiel chapter 16. Ezekiel 16. Now this is God metaphorically speaking about His people. God's not going to metaphorically speak about something that He wouldn't want to see in His own people. Look at verse 10. We'll begin in verse 9. He talks about Israel being born and left out in the open field as an unborn child in its blood. But then verse 9, then I washed you in water. Yes, I thoroughly washed off your blood, and I anointed you with oil. I clothed you in embroidered cloth and gave you sandals of badger skin. I clothed you with fine linen and covered you with silk. I adorned you with ornaments, put bracelets on your wrist and a chain on your neck. And I put a jewel in your nose, earrings in your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head. Thus you were adorned with gold and silver, and your clothing was of fine linen, silk, and embroidered cloth. You ate pastry of fine flour, honey, and oil. You were exceedingly beautiful and succeeded to royalty. Your fame went out among the nations because of your beauty, for it was perfect through my splendor, which I had bestowed on you. God is metaphorically speaking about His people, but what does He compare it to? He's a husband who is adorning his wife with these kinds of things. Now look over at 1 Peter chapter 3, and this is what tells you you can press things too far. You don't want to press things too far and miss the point that Paul is talking about a woman dressing in a godly way, which represents her character, but that doesn't mean she can't make herself look attractive. Now notice, verse 3. Do not let your adornment be merely outward. Okay, it's not just outward. Arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Well, you do arrange your hair. You do wear some jewelry, and you do put on some clothes. Well, wait a minute. If it's wrong to do those things, then women need to be walking around how? Naked. Absolutely. If you press the words too far, then what Peter is condemning is wearing clothes at all. And we know that's not true. So, we can't press these things beyond reasonable limits. Paul's censure is not against moderation, but an indictment of extremism. Somebody says, well, when is the line crossed by a Christian woman? Well, I can't give you... Look.
Tell you what the line is, I know when it's been crossed.
Yeah, it was the Supreme Court Justice, I forget which one, that said he didn't know how to define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it. But there are classes, and I've heard of classes, women and men teaching classes, that are more than willing to tell you how many inches from the knee you can wear your shorts, how wide the straps on your shoulders can be, and all of that, which is all fine. I don't have a problem with advising people. But teaching it as if it's taught in the Bible is a whole nother problem. I'm just throwing that out there. That you know exactly in our modern day what you can wear and not wear. I think it's, we need to use some common sense, but in the end, there are some things that are matters of judgment, and I can't always go to the Bible and say, well, it tells me right here that this particular shirt or this particular pair of pants or shoes is, you're going to have to make some judgments. Yes?
Well, let's start not to make this argument with me. No, that's not the way to put it. My mother and dad obeyed the gospel in Trenton, Florida in 1943 under Brother Marshall Keeble as he was making his trek all through Florida. I did in 1954, and it seems to me that this argument, well, not women notwithstanding, but the men, have been asked to do modest things, if you would. If you're going to serve, for an example, and I hope somebody don't get on the high horse based on what I'm getting ready to these statements. But men have been asked, well, just wear a tie if you're going to read the scripture, if you're going to serve on the table. Well, now, brother, you mean I need to have a three-piece tweed suit on before I can do that? The Lord accept me just as I am. It's an argument as old as I am.
Yeah. And frankly, I've seen bad attitudes on both sides of the argument.
Yeah.
I've seen people who absolutely demand that you dress in a certain way. I've seen others who were so the opposite that they actually dressed down on purpose when they could have dressed better. I know this for a fact, just to prove a point to somebody, that I don't have to dress up. And either attitude is a problem. What this says here is we shouldn't dress in such a way in our public worship. And by the way, the principles we're talking about certainly cross over into other areas of life, although obviously what I wear at a ball game is not going to be the same thing I wear at public worship. But the bottom line is I shouldn't dress in such a way to worship that I am a distraction to people in their worship, whatever it might be. Like I said last week, somebody could walk in here dressed like they're going to the Kentucky Derby and have one of those ridiculous hats on and be a bad distraction, just like somebody who's underdressed or inappropriately dressed. So it is an injunction against extremes and being distractive in the public worship. And so I used to, 30 years ago, I could get up here and tell you, if you wanted to talk about what I should wear to worship, I could say, well, you wouldn't wear that to a funeral. I can't say that anymore. Can I?
No.
You wouldn't wear that to work. I can't say that either. The fact of the matter is styles and culture changes. Is anybody here wearing the same thing that they wore 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago? No. We have to apply the principles that we have here to the society and culture in which we live. And so I would caution everybody, don't go out of your way to offend people, and at the same time, don't go out of your way to judge other people either.
Well, like you say, a distraction is a hindrance to our work.
Absolutely. I do think that there is a spiritual dignity that we ought to take some pride in when we worship. I can still make the argument that I am coming into the presence of God, and maybe I should take that into consideration. I guess since I can't use funerals anymore and I can't use, other events, I guess about the only thing I can say now is if you went to the White House, okay, to meet the president, would you dress the same that you do in worship?
Well, I don't think you can say that either, because I remember when W was president, there was a group of ladies went there with what I refer to, hope again nobody don't take offense, shower shoes.
Yeah, it was a big deal. I saw it in the news. It was the U.S. women's soccer team that went to the White House, and they got written up in all the newspapers because they were wearing flip-flops. I mean, they had on dresses or whatever they were wearing, skirts, but they had on flip-flops at the White House. I hear you. And we can argue over some silly things, can't we? I just don't like the sound of flip-flops. Isn't that why they call them flip-flop?
Well, that was the shoe in Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. That's all they had.
But how is this Christian woman to clothe herself? Let's go back to 1 Timothy 2. It says, but which is proper for what? Women professing godliness. Now there's some guidance. Women professing godliness with good works. Godliness, that is reverence for God. Well, This Christian woman's going to want to dress proper reverence for God. And the way she does that is not by flamboyance or some extreme to one or the other. He now turns his attention to verse 11 with regard to the woman's involvement in the worship activities of the church. What is she to do? Well, that's not a great translation there. American Standard is better, and almost your modern translations say, let a woman learn in quietness. This, mine, the New King James says, let her learn in silence. First of all, she is commanded to learn. That is the acquisition of knowledge or skill by means of instruction. And the point I want to make there is, contrary to what the leftists and the liberals in this country think, Christianity has been the most uplifting religion for women ever to grace this earth. Women were treated as chattel, property in the first century before Christianity. And that was never God's intention. She was made as a help suitable for her husband. And there are religions in this world now that think a woman is either too stupid or too beneath a man to learn. And so they're forbidden to do what? Go to school and learn things. There are religions that teach that. In fact, one of them is one of the largest in the world. That's not Christianity. Christianity says, let a woman what? Learn. So that's the first thing we need to understand. It encourages the education of women. Second, it says they're to learn in quietness, not silence. The Greek noun is Hesuchia. How do you say that? To suit you. You're no help at all. I look over here for some help. And that word is used 3 other times in the New Testament, and the fact that it doesn't mean total silence is easy to see in its context. Turn over to Acts chapter 22. Now, Paul is addressing an unruly crowd here. Go back to chapter 21, verse 40. So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great, now the New King James says, when there was a great silence. So when I read that in English, silence, 21 verse 40. Yeah, I want you to go back to the end of the prior chapter. There was a great silence. Well, when I read the word silence in English, I think what? Total silence, no sound. And then he starts to speak to them. But go over to chapter 22, verse 2. And when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they did what? Kept even more silent. Well, how do you keep more silent? Well, you don't, because that's not a good translation of that word. They were quiet. They quieted down. They weren't totally silent. I doubt we've ever had a worship service. If you're in a congregation of any size at all, I don't know if there's ever been a worship service where there's total silence. Have you? I mean, even when the preacher's preaching, there's either somebody whispering to somebody or some baby crying. But the word is quiet. So the crowd was quiet. And then when they heard Paul preaching in their language, they became even more quiet. That's what the word here is in Timothy. And so you can also look at cognate forms of the word which help. For instance, go over to Acts 11. Go back to Acts 11, I should say. Back to Acts 11. Look about verse 18. When they heard these things, they became silent. Well, wait a minute. They became silent and they glorified God, saying, well, wait a minute. How did they become silent and then they're glorifying God, saying? Okay, you see the connection, and it does that in other places. So again, it's quietness. And it is a psychological and religious more so than physical. As one commentator put it, it calls for an attitude of attentiveness and receptiveness. But you have a corresponding phrase. Let's go back. There is a corresponding phrase to help us in this as we define what's going on here. And the phrase is, let a woman learn in quietness with all what? With all what?
Subjection.
Submission, submissiveness, subjections used in the King James. The word is H-U-P-O-T-A-G-E, hupotage. It suggests a recognition of one's proper role in an integrated society of relationships. In other words, for instance, if I go over to 1 Corinthians 11, I know that there's a proper hierarchy. There's a proper order of things, and I recognize and respect the proper order of things. What is the proper order of things? According to 1 Corinthians 11, God, Christ, man, woman. Okay? And I need to respect that. That's the way God's set it up. But see, then he contrasts that, or he has been contrasting. In verse 8, he desired that men prayed everywhere. Right? But look at verse 12. And I do not permit. There's a contrast. I do not permit. Men pray everywhere. But I don't permit a woman to teach or to have authority. And that's the correct translation there, not usurp. Usurp is an over-translation. Usurp in English carries the idea of what?
Overthrowing.
Yeah, I'm wresting something away from somebody. That's not the word here in the Greek. Okay. Have authority over is a good translation in the New King James. But I permit not a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. So on the other hand, if he says I don't permit, well, that's pretty obvious. Don't do this. It's, by the way, that is a present tense form verb that emphasizes continual action and an abiding attitude. In other words, it's an abiding command. It is a binding command for all churches and all places. A woman not to teach. Well, what does that mean? A woman, he doesn't permit a woman to teach. Well, let's talk about what it doesn't mean, what we can gather. Number one, it cannot prohibit a woman from teaching per se, because in other places, Paul tells mature Christian women that they should be what? Teachers of what is good, right? Training young women. So it's not a total prohibition against teaching. It does not suggest that a woman can never, under any circumstance, teach a man. Because in Acts chapter 18, what does it say? And I know there are some that will say, well, that was all Aquila, right? When they took Apollos aside and expounded unto him the way of God more accurately, that word expounding means to convey information by careful elaboration or to explain. That's the Greek word. An extended one-way discussion. That's teaching, and the Bible says they were both teaching him. Number three, the term does not prohibit all teaching by a woman, even in a church assembly. Even in the worship assembly this morning, there are women sitting here right now who will be teaching me. And how will you do that? Like Colossians 3:16. Absolutely. What do we do when we sing? We teach. We admonish one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So you women, when you start singing this morning, will be teaching the men. But you will not be having authority over the men. And that is the injunction here. So, what is the type of teaching that is forbidden, is our question. That word is didasco. I received a book, maybe 2, from a preacher here in the Brotherhood, and he wrote a like 2-volume thing on what didasco means. I've never seen such a mess. Because he had some axe to grind. The woman cannot assume the office of a public teacher. And most of your best conservative expositors agree that this applies to public worship. And that's where women are not to teach. It is an act of authority when the church is assembled that subordinates the men present if the woman teaches, and that is further seen with the qualifying phrase, right? Not to teach or what? Have authority over a man. I mean, that's part of the purpose or the reason. This is a joining of negative sentences or clauses to others of the same kind. They're part of the same definition. That's the point. What I'm saying is that second phrase is the point that Paul is saying. You don't teach in public setting, women, because when you do, you then have authority over men. Okay. It's the second phrase is the basis for the first. Such activity by the woman in the public assembly would constitute wielding authority over men. There's all kinds of Greek lexicons and so forth you can go to that take this position. The position of the teacher or preacher in the assembly implies superiority and authority over those that are taught. The teacher acts as the master who is to be heard and heeded. In fact, in your New Testament, in the King James Version, when the disciples and others refer to Jesus as master, what are they saying? Teacher. And while I am not, from a human vantage point, superior to or better than anybody in this room, when I stand here, however, I do exercise some authority over this situation here, do I not? And of course, James said, don't be many teachers. Why? Well, he didn't say we don't need any teachers. I don't want anybody to teach. What he said was, if you're going to teach, you need to do what? You need to take it seriously. And then, of course, he says to have authority over men, but to be in silence. Well, that's the same word again. Quietness. But not usurp, which is the sense of grasping authority. This just means to have, or another good translation might be to exercise authority. I don't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority. So, Paul's going to move to the theological foundation for these instructions, right? Somebody says, well, that was the first century, and you just told us that women were, at the bottom of the food chain in the first century. So that's what Paul, that's the foundation of his instruction. It's cultural. Well, there's a theological foundation, and he gives it for these different responsibilities of men and women. We can probably break them down. You can break it down a lot of different ways, but we'll look at 3. Verse 13, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved. That's not a good translation, in childbearing. It should be, what? Somebody got another version. American Standard says, through childbearing, not in childbearing. In other words, this doesn't mean, okay, women, if you submit yourself, then you'll survive childbirth. Okay? And how do I know that? Well, most women do, but not everybody does. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether you go to church or religious or not. But it should say, nevertheless, she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control or self-restraint. So, number one, Paul says the reason for this instruction is the chronological priority in the creation account. I mean, that's pretty simple, right? Verse 13. Adam was formed first, then Eve. Somebody says, well, wait, why is that? Don't ask me why. I'm just telling you. Chronology doesn't always mean you're going from greater to lesser. For instance, who was born first in this world? Adam or Christ? Not a trick question. Who was born into the world first? Adam or Christ? Adam. He actually wasn't born. Adam was here first. Who's greater? Christ or Adam? Christ. Chronology, then, doesn't have to do with going from greater to lesser all the time. But the point is, in the order of human creation, there was a priority. And when you go to Genesis chapter 2, from the very beginning, a woman was designed to be man's companion, helper, suited for him, not to be abused or used, but to be loved and cherished as a divinely designed partner. And so, Paul says there is something to the order of creation. It's just that simple. That's number one. Number two, the woman was the first to rebel against God. Eve led humanity into sin. She led, Adam followed. Now that was some sorry leadership on both of their parts. First of all, Eve took the spiritual lead in the home that should have been the male. And Adam should have taken the spiritual leadership, but he didn't. Let Eve. And third, there is the nature of the sin as distinguished from Adam. Adam was not, and don't ask me why, but God says there's a difference. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was. And so in some way, Adam's sin was qualitatively less. And you say, well, what's this all about? I don't know. Is there an indication of gender vulnerability here? Apparently Adam wasn't deceived. He wasn't gullible, if you will. What was Adam's problem? Whatever my good-looking wife tells me to do, I'm going to do. And especially if she's crying, right? I mean, my wife wants me to eat this, and I want to keep peace in the home. Adam knew what he was doing he shouldn't be doing, but he wasn't fooled by Satan.
No.
They were both in sin, but it's a different nature to the sin, Paul says. And don't shoot me. I'm just telling you what it says. And actually this word is used twice. And this is the interesting thing about it. Adam was not deceived. That word is apatao. The second word is xapatao, which means totally deceived. In other words, Eve was totally taken in by Satan. And of course, fell into transgression. I think the American Standard says has fallen into transgression. That verb is a perfect tense form denoting a permanent consequence. There was permanent consequences to their actions. So, somebody's going to say, well, that was the first century. This is now. Paul says, I've given you 3 reasons. And by the way, those reasons haven't changed. In other words, look at those reasons, and those reasons spanned humanity's history. Nothing's changed, has it? I mean, Adam was formed first, and he will always have been formed first. Eve was deceived, right? And she's the one that sinned. She sinned first, and the nature of her sin was different. That's not going to change. So if that's not going to change, then how can I change the male and female role in the public leadership of the church. Why can't? Now, verse 15 is difficult. I mean, there's a lot of different ideas on what this means. And you're going to have to wait to hear some of those ideas. Next time. You're going to have to wait 2 weeks. Because I'm going on vacation. And this man right here is going to teach class. Thanks.